in chat. Tell me how you're feeling. What's the vibe? Let's do it. Let's get warmed up. What's everyone's feelings today? If you had to pick it via an emoji, I'll add my own as well. Oh no, I'm sorry, Tatiana. That is no fun. Awesome. James was feeling excited. I love that. How about the rest of you folks? I'm feeling stoked too. We're talking about conditionals, so we're starting to get really fun, I think. Coding in JavaScript. I got some hand raised. We got some exciting elf gifts. Chris, appreciate that. Happiness is power. All right, excellent, y'all. Hope y'all are feeling good. I'm excited to dive in today. Let's go ahead and do it. So as discussed, today we're talking about, get out of the way, Zoom. There we go. Conditional branching. At this point, and this is the point where we're really going to start to leverage a lot of the skills that we've learned over the past 2 weeks or so in JavaScript. So I'm excited to see what you all do with it as we dive into some more deep problem solving. So the plan for today, we're going to explore conditional branching in JavaScript, focusing on if, else, and else if statements. We're also going to learn about switch statements as well, and the concept of truthiness and falsiness. We're hoping by the end, you're going to be able to write if, else, and else if statements effectively, understand how to nest those kinds of conditional statements, and apply logical operators within conditional branching. That is the plan. We got a busy schedule, a lot of different content to go through. Thankfully, I hope a lot of it will make sense, but there's going to be a lot of new syntax that we got to get through, which I'm certain will throw some folks for a loop. So let's prepare for that. There are no like check-in questions or anything like that, no quizzing, but we do have this warm-up question. All right, imagine you are planning a day at the beach, wherever you may be. We're at the tail end of summer here in Seattle. It's already gotten cold. So the beach day planning is over, but perhaps for some of you planning a day at the beach. And the weather forecast is uncertain. You have 2 options for activities: a beach picnic or a visit to a museum. Decision depends on the weather conditions. What factors would you consider when deciding between a beach picnic and a visit to a museum? So what do y'all think? You're trying to make this decision about what to do, perhaps on some weekend with the day off. How would you make this decision between going to a museum or going to a beach for a picnic? What are some of the different conditions you would think about as being important? All right, so we got some folks starting to weigh in. Got that several people are typing. Yeah, this isn't a coding question. I'm just asking you all for life advice. I just need some support here. How do we decide? Sure, we're not go for a picnic if it's raining outside. I did exactly that yesterday, so I really needed that advice. What else do y'all think? What are some other conditions we might consider when making this decision? All right, folks picking up on weather, right? Actually, a good point. It usually does not rain inside of museums because we gotta check the museum to make sure it's not some postmodern experience. But indeed. All right, excellent. Yeah, y'all picking some fun conditions. So certainly weather matters here in terms of deciding, and you might sort of be looking at the weather forecast. If we sort of excluded weather, what are some other conditions that might matter in terms of making this decision? I already have some folks saying, well, what if there's a third option, which is not going anywhere? That might be important as well. What are some other conditions you all might think of that would help you decide between two different vacation spots. Yeah, excellent. Right. How far away each of them is, right? That could be important if one's 10-minute walk away and the other's, an hour and a half drive. That's going to feel very different. Timo, you're just saying my mood. Absolutely, right? It could be depending on if you're feeling a little bit chill, maybe you just want to relax. Perhaps that pushes you in one direction or the other. Talking about pointing out parking. Dragish is pointing out important if the museum is open, right? So checking sort of times for all these different things. There's transportation, thanks, Joseph. Yeah, there's so many different conditions, so many different variables we sort of have to keep in mind when we're planning out one of these trips. These are all things we could build a program around to help us make this kind of decision. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Oops, jump right ahead. Yeah, okay. All right, we're good. All right, so conditional statements in JavaScript are crucial for making decisions based on certain conditions in your code. They allow you to execute different blocks of code depending on whether a specified condition evaluates to true or false. The three form of conditional statements in JavaScript are if else, and else if statements. We see an example right here. An if statement is used to execute a block of code if a specified condition evaluates to true. So as I was talking about yesterday, this module is really about how to start to make decisions in your code. Yesterday, we talked about sort of setting up different evaluations, right, in certain ways using the different equivalency signs, as well as greater than or less than, things like that. Today, we're going to use those to start to actually make the decisions in our program. And what we're looking at here is a simple if statement. This if statement has a condition in it, and it's going to help us determine if we want to run some code within it. So breaking this down, there's a few different parts to an if statement. The first is the if keyword. Saying keyword really explicitly here, just like the let keyword, just like the const keyword. These are special terms in JavaScript that will do something. Right, so this keyword is used to initiate the if statement. You'll have to have an if keyword to start the if statement. Next part is the condition. The parentheses there are part of the actual syntax itself. Whatever goes inside those parentheses will get evaluated to true or false. If that entire expression, that condition, is true, then the code inside of those curly braces will run. The code inside the curly braces, that is called a block of code. All right, this is the body of the if statement. We can write a whole bunch of lines of code in there. That code within those curly braces will only run if that condition is true. Otherwise, our program will skip over all of it, right? So it's possible if the condition is false that we don't run any of those lines. So this if statement allows us to encapsulate some code to only run depending on a particular condition. Let's take a look at an example. All right, so we have an example over here of an if statement. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this over here so we can take a look. Excellent. So what we're looking at right here is we have a variable declared here, temperature. It's set equal to 27. And in our if statement, you'll see we're using the greater than sign. We're saying if temperature is greater than 30, go ahead and console log out. It's a hot day. So if I run this code right now, what do you all expect to happen? If I run this code right now as to what we're looking at, what do we expect to happen? All right, excellent. Yeah, let's take a look. All right, so in this case, we can see the program did run, right? We see this little command up here, node script.js. In this case, nothing gets printed out. That's because the console log statement is encapsulated within these curly braces. So because temperature is not greater than 30, this code does not run. If we change our value to a higher value, right? So temperature is now 35. In this case, it will go ahead and actually print out the code within there. It'll actually evaluate correctly. Or rather, I should say, the code within the the if statement within that if body is printed out. Tatiana, is that your temperature? where you're at? It's 27. Excellent. Also, this is just an if statement. It's important to note we can write as many lines of code as we want in here, right? So, how does this suggest that? How weird. I wanted to add a little emoji in here as well. Right, there's no limit to the number of lines of code that can go within here. All of these are encapsulated and are dependent on this condition, right? So if I switch this back, we will not see any of that content run. We will, of course, just to be really clear, if there's any other code around it, that code will still run as expected and will run if the condition is hit. Okay, so an if statement, we just need to pass in some kind of condition. All the code within that block will run if the condition evaluates to true. Any questions on this before I move ahead? All right. I think thankfully this is pretty straightforward at this moment, right? We just need to make sure to get the syntax, which it's easy to kind of forget a curly brace here or there. I guess actually let's take a look at that error. If, for example, I forget this curly brace, let's see if anything weird happens. Yeah, so here we get this unexpected token. If you see something like this, it might be because you've forgotten or added an extra curly brace, something like that. So something to keep in mind. All right, let's move on. So now we have an exercise for you all to get some practice in. So I'll pass it over to you. There is a solution here, but don't peek just yet. Go ahead and take a moment or two to try it out. We're going to take a number of steps. You're going to go ahead and declare a variable named myNumber and assign it a numeric value. Use an if statement to check if the number is even. If the number is even, log the number is even. If the number is not even, don't do anything. All right, pass over to you all. Let's take, we'll say, I don't know, 2.5 minutes or so, get this started. I'll check we'll check in after that in terms of where folks are at. And if you all want more time, we can do that. So give it a shot, particularly before checking the solution. Thank you. All right, no worries if you're still working on it. I'm gonna go ahead and get started on it. Feel free to finish if you're crushing it. Otherwise, go ahead and follow along. So thanks for those of you who shared some of your output here. Just I'm guessing you're working with prompt, which is very cool. Very much ahead of us, but I love it. All right, so we're gonna first declare a variable named myNumber, assign it a numeric value. Let's start with 10. Then we're gonna use our if statement. So remember, for an if statement, we need the if keyword. We're going to do parentheses after that, and then we need our curly braces. Often when I'm writing an if statement, I'll actually just put out this entire structure, right? So I can start to fill things in so I'm not getting sort of stuck halfway through. Within the if statement, we need to check if the number is even. How do we do that? How did you all solve this part of it? How do we check if a number is even? What operator, perhaps, did you all need to use? Yeah, thanks, Tatiana. All right, so we need to use modulo, right? So in this case, we can check if myNumber modulo 2, if that is equal to 0, right? That means it is indeed even because there's nothing left over. There's no remainder, right? So within here, then, we're going to console log. The number is even. Excellent. And if number is not even, so if it's odd, we're not going to do anything. So in this case, we can just leave as is. Let's go ahead and run our code. Excellent. The number is even. If I change it to an odd number, we see nothing. So that is what we are looking for. This, I would say, is the most explicit way of doing this right now, but it looks like perhaps some of you all had some other ideas as well. Any questions about this before we move on? All right, seems like we're good. I think as you can see from some of your classmates, Yeah, go for it, Namar. As you can see from some of your classmates, there you can add other statements around this, right? There's lots of other code we can introduce into this. Yeah, Namar asks, why const and not let? No particular reason. Well, I'll say this, both will work just fine. That's okay. So there's not like a functional difference there. I typically will define my variables first with const until I need to redefine them. I think that way, as much as possible, the program is sort of solidified in some way. But that's a bit of a personal preference. And I think sort of a default I have. There's not actually a right answer there. All right, let's continue on. Well done, y'all. Quick knowledge check. What is the purpose of the if statement in JavaScript? What do you all think? A, B, C, D. You're not sure. You got a 25% chance. Yeah, right. Excellent. And let's see. We want to execute a block of code conditionally based on specified condition. All right, cool. Let's complicate that if statement. So as it just was saying, really wanted to add an else statement there, right? In this case, we want to be able to perhaps do something different if the condition is false. So our if else statement will allow us to do that. So else here is something we can tack on to the if statement. We add the else keyword and then another block of code. We can see this breakdown here, right? So we still need that if keyword. We'll still need that condition. That's going to determine whether either chunk of code runs. And the else keyword is defining what happens if that statement is false. Let's take a look at an example here. I'm going to copy this, overwrite what we have here. So we have an example here. A variable defined as the word age, that's set equal to 20. And then our conditional is checking if age is greater than or equal to 18, we're going to print out one statement. Otherwise, we're going to print out some other statement, right? So we can hit run code here, and we can see because age is 20, that's greater than or equal to 18, we get this first statement coming out, you are eligible to vote. If we decrease this number to 16, we'll see you are not eligible to vote. So that's how an if and else works, right? So we can see, just like before, we can put any number of lines of code in here. And go ahead and run those, right? And we'll be able to see all of that output. Excellent. Not too bad so far, right? So we have two different conditions, two different situations, two different results that may come about as a result of this condition evaluating to true or false. All right, passing it back to you all. So we'll take a couple minutes to do this as well. Very similar to before, declare a variable named our number and assign it a numeric value. Use an if-else statement to check if the number is even or not. If the number is even, the number is even. If the number is not even, the number is not even. Or you could say the number is odd. I'll just put 90 seconds up. Go ahead and take this out again. I know it's a little familiar, but we can just get some practice here overall. And we'll check back in just a bit. We are at time here. Let's go ahead and flip back over here. Dragosh, I'll get your question in just a moment here. Let's go ahead and walk through this one more time. So I'll use const here, but again, we could use let to declare our number, to assign it a numeric value. And we're going to make our if-else statement. Here's what that looks like with nothing inside of it. It looks a little wild. So remember, we're setting up those curly braces. Within those curly braces are the blocks of code they're going to run depending on the condition. We're going to check again. This number is even. Notice here I'm using strict equality. I guess I didn't say this last time, but I'm using strict equality as my default overall. loose equality would work, right? We're expecting a number to come back from this. So no matter what you choose, it should be fine. But I typically stick with strict equality. Inside of here, we're going to say the number is even. And then just to differentiate a little bit, I'm going to say the number is odd. Let's go ahead and run our code. So this first number that comes out, this first result that comes out for 99 is the number is odd. We round up to an even 100, we get the number is even. All right, so depending on the condition, that's what's going to trigger each block of code here. Drago's just asking about using the prompt word. So that's probably not working because we need the prompt import. Joseph, if you're using the prompt import, do you mind sharing that code in chat? It's going to be something like prompt equals require prompt sync, and then there's something that goes in here. I want to say SIGINT something. Oh, you just used it. Great. Excellent. So again, we haven't really talked too much about this, but this line requires that we well, sorry, how do I say this? This is our package. This actually pulls in the package for us to use. So without this, prompt doesn't mean anything. Prompt is not a special JavaScript. This is not especially built into JavaScript via Node. It is something we have to actually manually pull in. You all may have sort of blanked it out looking at the previous lessons because it's always in every script that we had. So hopefully something like that should solve it. Let's try it. Let's just see what happens. Just this, and then we could say, oh, I guess actually, sorry, we need to put that in here. I think this should be good. This will cause some problems for us, which is really nice. All right, so go ahead and run this code. So notice up here, I've included in prompt. You all don't need to do this, but this is sort of a nice merging of some of our skills. So that's been imported. Let's go ahead and run it. All right, so what's my number? 100. Excellent. It says the number is even. We run it again. So I put in 1, and that number is on. Excellent. One thing to know, what data type is our number when we use prompt? This is, I'm pulling back from yesterday and last week. What data type is our number when it comes in? Yeah, it's coming in as a string, right? So this is actually working because of, what was it? What did we talk about yesterday? What's the term for what JavaScript is doing here to transform this into a number that can be evaluated? Yeah, so modulo is the actual operator, right? That's performing that. That's true. We had a special like term we were using yesterday to talk about it. Well, that several people are typing. Just gets me excited. Some good stuff's coming. Yeah, it was a conversion, coercion, points all around, right? It's all good. So in this case, we are coercing this string into a number because it's happening automatically, it's happening forcefully. If we wanted to be really explicit, we could do something like, I'll say like user input. Let's fix the code here. And then maybe explicitly convert that value to a number. This is, I would say, a bit more explicit because we're really trying to say, great, this is now a number. We want to do number things, right, with modulo, but either will work. Thanks, job, y'all, for holding back there. I know sometimes it can be easy to forget what we just talked about. This is all excellent. Now we have a pretty cool program here, right? We can start to see how powerful this if statement is once we're trying to work with user inputs as well. All right, let's keep it going. Quick knowledge check here. When is the code inside the else block of an if-else statement executed? What do you all think? A, B, C, or D? Talking about code inside of the else block that is within those curly braces. Yeah, excellent. Right, it's B. So when the condition is false, that's what we're looking for. Right. Let's complicate it more. Let's just add on more complications here. So now we can also add else if keyword to check for multiple conditions. So what we're looking at here is we are now going to be able to add conditions to this entire statement to make it a bit more complicated, but also more flexible depending on what the input is that we're checking. So in terms of the different, the actual syntax that we're looking at here, this first condition, condition 1, if that condition evaluates to true, then everything within code block 1, that is the code that will run. If that is false, we'll move to the next condition, which is with that else if keyword, separated by a space. So else if condition 2 will be checked. If that condition is true, we will then execute the code that is in code block 2. If that's false, which means both condition 1 and condition 2 are false, then we go to code block 3, where that code is initiated. There is no limit to the number of, I was anticipating these here. There's no limit to the number of else if statements you can have. You can just keep chaining them up. There's some other tools, as we'll see, that might make it more clear, but it is not uncommon to have a few else if statements, or to put it another way, a few conditions that we are checking. All right, let's take a look at a couple examples here. So I'll copy this and I'm going to overwrite what we have here. Let's take a look at this. So we've declared a variable up at the top here in this example. Excuse me. It says day of week. Currently, it's set to Wednesday. We then check if it is equivalent to first the string Monday. This is going to be, in this case, it'll be false, right? So we check again. This next condition checks if it is equal to Wednesday. In this case, it is true. So this console log will run, and then the entire statement is done. That's how it's going to work. Go ahead and run this code. Excellent. It's the middle of the week. If we change this up, right, we change it up, let's say to Friday. We get this console log because we've skipped past the other two conditions, which are false. Right, both those conditions are false, but the third else if, or third condition, I should say, is true. If we pick a totally different day, you get to the very end where we have an else statement, and the code inside of there will run. So it just depends on which one of these is true first. Let me just take a look here. Yeah, we'll do an exercise for a second. So one thing I just want to note here too is, I'll move this out. It's again that sort of idea of it depends on which one is evaluated first. So just as an example here, I'm going to say let temp equal 25. So if we say if temp is greater than 30, else if temp is greater than 25, else if temp is greater than 21, that should be enough here. So a couple different options here. And this comes in if we said this was A, this was B, this was C, this is D, this is E. So based on this variable right here, which one of these blocks of code would run based on this if, else statement? Which chunk of code here? A, B, C, D, or E? What do y'all think? All right, we got to vote for C. Anyone think differently? Anyone else concur? Vote. Let's wait in there. See what's going to happen. Yeah, so in this case, the first block of code that would evaluate would be the block of code in C. So remember here, so temp is 25, so 25 is not greater than 25, so we skip past this. We then get to block C, 25 is greater than 20, we'll go ahead and run that code. However, note, this condition is still true, right? 25 is greater than 15, but that doesn't mean we then run the code within D. It checks for the first match, going from top to bottom, the first one, where that condition evaluates to true, runs the code, and then quits the overall statement. All right, so if we wanted something like both C and D to run, we need to write our code a little bit differently. All right, let's move on to the exercise over here. So for this one, we're going to practice just that. We're going to create a bunch of else if statements. We're going to declare a variable first called student score, assign it a numeric value, and then use conditional statements to classify student scored into different grade categories using these following scores. So if it's 90 or above, that's going to be an A plus, 80, 89 is an A, 70, 79 is a B, et cetera, all the way down. Then depending on what the match is here, what the score is, you're going to console log out what that user's grade is. So that's the plan. It's going to be a lot of different conditionals in order to write this. So we'll give you all about, we'll say 2.5, 3 minutes. If you get to a good spot, please do share your output in live chat. And then we'll come back together and talk through it. All right, y'all. How'd it go? It's a lot of code to write, right? Lots of else if statements. Let's take a look. I want to copy this over just so we don't have to waste time with you all just watching me type. I don't know how interesting that is. Very well. Clean this up a little bit here. Excellent. Love you all trying out with that prompt stuff. It's very cool. All right, so in this case, what we're looking at here is a number of else if statements, or the number of conditional statements that are checked for in here. So the first condition here is student score greater than or equal to 90, and then we have console log grade is an A plus. If the student score is greater than or equal to 80, console log grade A, so on and so forth. All the way down to if the score does not match any of these, that's where we give the grade F. So thankfully quite duplicative, right? A lot of these lines look the same, but you can imagine it starts to get a bit complex. If each of these blocks of code had more than just the one line, that's going to start to turn into some pretty verbose code. So this starts to get to the point where we really want to consider and think about readability. How easy is it to like work through our code? Because if I forget one symbol halfway through here, it's not super easy to immediately identify where the problem is, right? We really need to use our error deducing skills to figure out what's going on and watch somewhat carefully some of the syntax highlight and see this little parentheses a bit more red here than the others. So this is where your IDE and errors can really help you out as the code gets a bit more complicated. All right, before we move on, any questions about this code? If statements, else if statements, else statements, anything like that? I think thankfully the concept makes a lot of sense, right? It's pretty intuitive, I would say. You're just sort of deciding between different parts of what you want to do. But I think the syntax can be challenging, particularly as we start to add a lot of typing here, right? This can start to get a little tricky to make sure everything is set as it needs to get set. All right, excellent. So next we're going to talk a little bit more about if statements. We're going to talk specifically about nesting if-else statements. So we might describe what we had just written as a long if-else statement, but it's relatively flat. And by flat, I mean it is aligned all the way to the left against sort of the text editor. As we nest statements, they're going to go a bit deeper. They're going to sort of trail to the right. This allows us to, nested if-else statements, make one decision, and then from that decision, make a couple other decisions as well. Let's think back to our work. We were talking about, what kind of vacation do we want to go on? Maybe the first order of business is just checking the weather, right? You want to say, hey, if it's, super cold outside, if it's really rainy, that's the first thing I want to do. If, that is the case, then we just want to go to the museum. Easy, don't need to make too many more decisions. But maybe in the else case there, we say, okay, well, if it's nice out, then maybe we want to check some other things like how's traffic, how far away is the beach, things like that, right? So we can start to put some of these decisions in like a higher priority than others and make some decisions based on other decisions. So how this looks, this image is kind of small, so let me pull this up for y'all. So what we're looking at here, so we have an outer condition and an inner condition in this sort of template example here. If the outer condition ends up being true, then within that block of code, we have another conditional. That inner condition will then be evaluated. If that's true, that's where the code right here is going to get executed. All the code within here, so above the if-else statement, and all the code within here will get run if both of these statements are true. If the first, the outer condition statement is false, we immediately jump down to the else statement where all the code here is run. If the first, the outer condition variable, if that condition evaluates to true, but the inner condition variable evaluates to false, we'll run all the code within here, and then all the code within the else statement. All right, so we're sort of gating our decision-making process by nesting these if statements. All right, so let's take a look at an example here. I'll clear out our previous work. Slide this over a little bit. Excellent. All right, so we have two variables up here. We have is rainy day. We have has umbrella. Right now, both of these are set to true. And then we have our first condition here. If is rainy day is true, then we're going to log out. It's a rainy day. If this person has an umbrella, if that is also true, then we're going to log out. You have an umbrella, stay dry. This person does not have an umbrella. We're going to say no umbrella. Watch out for those puddles and finds of cover. If is rainy day equals true, that is a false statement. We're going to console log out. It's not raining. Enjoy the day. Let's go ahead and run this code. So in the case of both being true, right, we see that both of these statements, both of these conditions are evaluated as true. So we get both of these two console log statements. If we change has umbrella to false, we'll get that first console log statement, but then we get a different second console log statement. And if the first condition is true, it doesn't actually matter what has umbrella is set to. We're just going to get it's not raining, enjoy the day. Right? So this sort of puts is rainy day at the top priority. It becomes more important in some ways than the nested ones, or at least it's our first decision-making point. Perhaps that's another way to put it. I don't know. A question here was, does this work like else if, or is there a limit of one outer and one inner condition? Nope, you can add as many outer, as many inner conditions as you would like to your if statement, right? So you can nest it all the way down. I will say, after you start to do a few of them, your code is going to start to look more confusing. And that may be a signal that, hey, maybe I can join some of these statements together. Maybe I need to think about how to make this code a bit simpler. But you absolutely can nest as many as you would like. Great. Any questions about this? I promised that It'll pick up in speed, right? And it is starting to indeed. We can see this syntax-wise starting to get a little bit trickier. Yeah, okay. These people only enjoy the day when it's not raining. I don't mind some rain. Then again, I live in one of the rainiest parts of the United States. So, all right. So, look, conclusion here. Nested conditions can be expanded to include more layers of complexity. While this provides flexibility in expressing intricate logic, as I've mentioned, it's important to maintain code readability and clarity to avoid confusion. I'll say in general, as you all are starting to write much more code, I think you're going to see, like, after you write 20, 50 lines of code, if there's a problem, you're going to start to feel like, oh my gosh, where in here is it, right? And that's where the cleaner you can write your code. By clean, I want to be clear what we're saying is that it's easy to read, it's easier to understand what the intention is. Perhaps you added comments to your code to try and clarify what the purpose is, right? That'll make it easier to solve some of those problems. So if you just continue to nest different decision points in there, it can get a bit tricky to debug and figure out what's going on. All right, we're at types of logical operations. I'm gonna check time here where we're at. I think we're doing pretty good. Yeah, I think we'll stay along with this schedule right now. We can finish these last little bits out, and then we'll take our well-deserved break. So we've talked about so far if else if statements, and we talked about nesting conditional statements. The conditional statements we've been looking at have been using our strict and loose equality and I suppose inequality, as well as our greater than, less than symbols, right? Those symbols will evaluate, will compare the two values on the left and the right and return a Boolean value of true or false. We have some other kinds of operators. These are called logical operators. I'm going to tell you all in advance, this can get a little bit tricky. So I'm going to do my best to sort of speak it out plainly. If we can really use the terms here as expected, it's a little bit easier, but the symbols, the syntax is definitely going to look a little wild as we continue to add on to this. So there are three main logical operators in JavaScript. We have our AND operator, which is two ampersands together. We have our OR operator, which is two pipes together. And we have the not operator. Not operator is actually just talking about this exclamation point right here. That is the not operator. This is actually not equal to, but not operator, we're talking about this exclamation point. All right, so let's take a look at this. Let me copy this over. Let me talk out what's happening here, and then we can sort of figure out the evaluation of it. So we have two variables here. We have x and y. X is 5, and y is equal to 10. Our condition here, we can see there's actually two different statements here. The first one is saying, is x less than 10? If we look at that, x is 5, so that is a true statement, right? So if we were just trying to figure out what's happening here, we have true. On the other side over here, we're saying, is y greater than 5? That's true, right? Because y is 10, 10 is indeed greater than 5. The ampersands here are going to check and join these two statements together. And it's basically saying, and are both of these things true? So the and operator will return true if what is on the left and what is on the right evaluate to true. So in this case, this side is true and this side is true. Therefore, the entire statement is true. If we say this more just like straightforwardly, this if statement is asking a question. Is x less than 10 and is y greater than 5? Yes, it is. Therefore, we'll log out both conditions are true. If we change one of those, so if we say y is now negative 10, right? Our left-hand side is true, but the right-hand side is false. And so in that case, something can't be both true and false, right? That makes sense. So we go to our else statement here. So at least one condition is false. This will be the case if the other side is true, or sorry, the other side is false and the right side is true. So if we set this to 50, right, that swaps order of these things. At least one condition is false. And if they're both wrong, if they're both false, it will also be false. So the and operator is checking, hey, is everything on the left and everything on the right, does that evaluate to true? There's a question here, safe to presume that several ampersands can be used to avoid using several nested if or else if conditions. Yeah, exactly that, right? So if we're trying to just check, hey, are two things true? We could use two if statements that are nested inside of each other, or we could just stick with the ampersands, which could join together and check, hey, are both of these things true at the same time? Quite useful. Another thing is we could add more on here. We can actually continue to ampersand our way, add more ands onto this. So we could check, hey, is y greater than 5 and is y less than 50? So in that case, to make that true, we could say 10. Let's set this back to 5. So we should now end up with true here. 5 is less than 10. Another true, 10 is greater than 5. And another true, 10 is less than 50. So in this case, I guess I should say all conditions are true. All right, what do y'all think? I will say, just looking at this feels a little, there's a lot going on, right? We can see all these different symbols, all these variables getting referenced. It can feel a little perhaps overwhelming. One thing I'll say is, for this kind of example, we're just checking numbers. This is totally fine. Not, maybe these are fine variable names. This is one of the reasons why it's really helpful as we build more complex code to have better variable names. Because just seeing x less than 10 and y greater than 5 and y less than 50, it's not quite as clear as perhaps some clear variable names might be. We'll talk about some examples of that assuming we have some time at the very end. All right, so those are and operators, checking that both things are true on either side. If you take a look at the or operator, the or operator is checking that at least one of these things is true. So that can mean both conditions are true, or just one is true. It will only go to the false case. It'll only be false if both conditions are false. So here, we have two variables, a and b. A is greater than 3. In this case, that is false, right? Because a is 2. So our example right here, this first part is false. But is b less than 5? Yes, that's true, right? 3 is indeed less than 5. And in this case, at least one condition is true. Same thing, if we swap around some numbers here, we can get either side to be true, or we can get both sides to be true, in which case we'll get that first console log statement. But if both are false, only then do we get both conditions are false. So or just works kind of as the opposite of and, right? And again, because of its terminology, hopefully that helps us make some sense of it, right? So when we read this out, how it's helpful to read this out is to say, hey, is either a greater than 3 or b less than 5? If one of those is true, then we can come back with this first block of code. All right, so let's check one more. So the not operator, we saw the not operator, sometimes called the interrobang. This not operator is, we saw it with not equals, right? We could put it in front of our equal sign to check if two values were not equivalent to one another. We also saw it when we were talking about, goodness, what was that? I think booleans. So it was where we were flipping some values back and forth. We were converting some values to booleans, where it flips the value and it can flip it back. So the not operator is used to invert a boolean value if the operand is true, not returns false. If the operand is false, not returns true. Let's take a look at this example. So here, this goes a little strange. So the value here is true, right? Not that value, not true, that's false. In the case of an if statement, if the condition up here is false, we go to the else case. That brings us down here to our else block of code, which means we console log out, the value is true, right? It sort of flipped it for us. If we use false, it's going to be the opposite, right? False gets flipped back to true. That means our first condition evaluates as true. And then we console log out the value is false. So the not operator just toggles us between true and false, depending on what that condition evaluates to. So it just toggles us between it. All right, before we get to Truthy and Falsy, any questions on this? I'm going to go over one more example here, but any questions on this before we move ahead? We talked about and, or, and the not operator. Right. Seems like perhaps we're okay. Let me go ahead and go over a bit more realistic example here. So I'm going to clear out our code here. Remember yesterday I talked to you all about Code Wars, right? It's a great site to practice some coding. We kind of looked a little bit at this, at the login screen, as a way for us to talk about different conditionals and evaluations to true, checking equality, right? Let's talk a bit more about that. So for many sign-up forms, I'm sure you all have used a gazillion of these, having been on the internet, right? We need to enter in a bunch of information. In order for this form to go, there are certain conditions that must be met. In order for us to sign up, we must meet certain conditions. If I just hit enlist now, notice we're getting a bunch of errors from this form. Let's try and think about how we could mock this out. We're not going to do all the code, of course, that would happen to get this sign up form to work, but how can we sort of mirror this a little bit with our conditional statements in here? So one thing we might do, and I'm going to sort of pseudocode this out. When I say pseudocode, I mean I'm sort of fake coding. I'm building the shell of it. Often when you pseudocode, you can pseudocode just with comments and sort of just talk through what you want to do. Or as I'll do here, I'm going to sort of come up with some variable names that we'll just define concretely. And then we can sort of play around with what this looks like and build the complexity a little bit later. So what I'm imagining here, if we take a look at this first value, so the email, we see here, it can't be blank, right? So I might have something here where it's to say, if email is blank, then I want to show a message to the user, right? This kind of variable name, I would say, is a nice one because it tells us exactly what we're checking for. Let's say I add in some text in here. Let's hit this again. Now it's saying invalid. Why is it saying this is invalid? Well, it's not in the right email format, right? So I might want some other kind of variable here. I said email is in correct format, right? Something like that. How can we do this? Well, there's a couple different ways. One is we could say, okay, we'll go ahead and nest if statement if email is in correct format. So if both of those things are true, I guess I should say incorrect if we want to follow this. We're sort of checking for incorrectness. So if email is blank and the email is in an incorrect format, we want to show some kind of show in error message to the user. Right, that's one way we can sort of think about these first checks. We could also do something like this, where we check for both. We say if email is blank and email is in incorrect format, show that message. Or in this case, it would actually be or, right? So if the email is blank, or the email is in incorrect format, we want to show the user some specific error message. So this is kind of where these things start to apply, thinking a bit more concretely about actual features we need to build, right? This sign up page probably has a number of conditionals of what we're looking for before a person can sign up. We're probably checking, first of all, that these values aren't blank. We're going to check to make sure that the email is invalid. My guess is we would check to make sure if the username follows a certain format, perhaps, or has a certain length overall. We'd want to check the password also follows some kind of certain format. And we'll need to check the password and password confirmation values equal one another. We also may need to do some additional work to check on sort of the back end. Has this email already been used? Has the username already been claimed? Right? There's a number of conditionals that would need to happen just to get someone to sign up. And that's more what we're going to be actually programming in the real world, not just playing around with numbers and checking the values against one another, right? So a couple different ways we can think of this. I would say this is going to be a more realistic situation where we're building something like a sign-up form. All right, let's move ahead and talk about this concept of truthiness and falsiness. I don't know why, this is one of my favorite little topics in programming because it just feels very silly to me to talk about truthiness and falsiness. So in JavaScript, another important concept is the idea of truthy and falsy. A value is considered truthy if it evaluates to true when coerced into a boolean, and falsy if it evaluates to false. So here are the values that are considered falsy in JavaScript. It is these ones right here. Pretty much everything else is truthy. Everything else is truthy. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at a little example here. So look to console log here is truthy, else is the falsy. Okay, so looking at our false values, if I type in if false here, this makes sense, right? We are expecting this to come back as falsy. It's false, we would hope so. Are there other values here as well? If we put in null, right, as an intentional empty value, when we run this code, we'll notice that null is falsy as well. All right, well, when would that matter? Well, so let's say we have something like password. Just like with their sign up, right? So we define password early in our program, and then we're waiting for the user to give us access to their password. So some code goes here. Down here, we might just check, hey, if password exists, that's kind of what this is saying. If the password is there, then we're going to go ahead and run some code. Otherwise, run some other code, right? Maybe show an error to the user, or make a request or something like that. So we can use this knowledge to check for sort of empty values. That goes for undefined as well. So if I have just let password right, which by default is declared as undefined, that'll trigger. This also works for the values, the numeric values, 0, -0, and not a number. Those are also falsy values. So this could be the case if we're checking for some kind of score or something like that. Excuse me. It was getting dry. I'm just chatting too much. In the case of 0, -0, or not a number, those will evaluate to false as well. So we can see that here. If 0, that is falsy. This is actually, strangely, slightly useful to check for even numbers. If we have 10 modulo 2, that will equal 0. I shouldn't actually put that in there. This will evaluate to 0. We can also sort of anticipate the fact that it'll be 0 by saying, okay, even stuff is going to go in our false case because 0 will evaluate to the falsy case here. The last one is an empty string. will also evaluate to false. But it says empty, not just doesn't have characters. If we add a white space in here, that is a character, so that counts as Truthy. But if it is literally just an empty string. So they have another example here that sort of doubles down on what I was talking about. Here we can do something sort of clever by checking if there is or is not a value at all. So if, for example, in this case, the username does exist, if username, then we're going to console log out something specifically for that user. Otherwise, we'll print out this statement of please provide a valid username. Right, so we can start to build these conditionals in some interesting ways by relying on truthy and falsy values. Right, any questions on that? Any questions on that? Let's see, this is a little bit strange in that there are certain values that just sort of evaluate. It would kind of be nice if it was a bit more explicit, but it is something that can be leveraged pretty nicely, as we can see with this example. Right, excellent. So I think the last thing we'll do before we take a break, is talk about a different kind of conditional statement structure called a switch statement. So a switch statement provides, it says here a more concise way to handle multiple conditions, although I don't know, I'll kind of contest that. It's a different way to handle multiple conditions. It can be a bit more clear in some ways in terms of what exactly it is you're checking. It has a very different structure to it. I think here, this next one, yes, will walk us through what these look like. All right, I'll blow this up a little bit so we can talk through it. So the switch statement, the wrappings of it are somewhat similar to an if statement, but the internals are very, very different. So we start with the switch keyword. This keyword is needed to start the switch statement. And then we have some kind of expression inside of here. This expression can evaluate to a number of different values. So the most typically what you're going to see inside of this expression is just like a variable name or something like that. We then follow that with curly braces. Everything within the curly braces is part of that switch statement. Within the switch statement, we have a number of cases. What the cases are checking is if this value that is pressed, that is added here, so value 1, if that matches the expression, whatever that expression evaluates to, then the code within that case will be run. So notice we have your case keyword, the value, followed by a colon, and then we can add multiple lines of code. And then we need this break keyword at the end. The break keyword is going to exit us out of the switch statement. We can add as many of these cases as we want with different values here that can be matched to the expression. So if case value 2, if that matches the expression instead, the code will be evaluated or executed here. And then we have that break keyword. We add as many as we need. And then finally, we have a default. You can think of default as kind of our else case, right? Say default, and then this goes, the default code runs if the expression is not matched by any of the cases. All right, so we have switch, case, break, and default as keywords we're using within this statement. Let's take a look at an example here. So I will copy this over. Oh, so much text. Let me enter this down a little bit so we can see everything on the screen. Okay, excellent. Let's move this up a little bit. Cool. Okay. I'm going to run this and we can talk through what the code is doing. Okay, so up here, we've defined one variable and we've set up another variable, right? So our first variable is defining characteristic, and that is set to some kind of quality. We can see there's a number of qualities down here. So here we're saying bravery. Then we've declared a new variable called favorite animal, right? Both using the let keyword. We then have our switch statement that starts with the switch keyword. we check the value of the defining characteristic, and that's what we're going to check and try and match to a number of our cases. So the first case here is the value we put in, bravery. If that happens, if it matches, which in this case it does, we're going to run this code here. The code we're running right now is we're reassigning the value from favorite animal from nothing, which is going to be undefined, to this string of lion. Then we break out of this, which means we'll get to the very end and we can close out of our switch statement and then print out those two different variables in a little statement here, right? So we're saying your defining characteristic is this, so your favorite animal must be that. All right, let's take a look at some other values we could put in here. So if I type in loyalty here, throw this over to you all now, what animal is going to pop out on the other end of this? If I type in a loyalty here as the defining characteristic, what value is going to pop out? All right, excellent. I'm getting wolf, right? So in this case, because we can see the case matches here, we can check the favorite animal must be wolf. All right, not bad. Let's make some other changes here. How do I change this to a kindness? Change this to kindness. What favorite animal is going to pop out? What animal are we going to be suggested as our favorite? Yeah, excellent. All right. In this case, it's going to say dinosaur. Dinosaurs are well known for being incredibly kind, right? So why is that? Because the case here does not match any of these, right? All right, let's swap it back to bravery. Then I'm going to remove this break keyword. And let's see what happens. What do you all think? What's going to be the value that is printed out here? So we set defining characteristic to bravery, but I removed the break keyword from, from the switch statement. What do you think? What animal do you think will be suggested to us? This one's trickier. All right, go ahead and make a guess. Make a guess up here. Think something. Okay, I think it's gonna be. I think it's gonna be lion, but I don't want to say. I think it's gonna be something different, but I want to say. So what do we get? We got fox. That's a little weird. What do y'all think? What's happening here? So we have the defining characteristic as bravery. We removed the break keyword from underneath bravery. And for some reason it's saying fox. What do you all think? Just make a guess. I mean, it's definitely, I would say, a bit strange, right? Till we end up with fox here. All right, so we got one suggestion here from Tatiana. It connected one with another and ignored the lion. So maybe it skipped over line entirely. Sure. Yeah, that could be what happened. What do the rest of y'all think? All right, so just says the code continues to the next case and the variable changed before printing out. It says it shows the second since the first wasn't key. But I assume you mean sort of it wasn't we didn't have the break keyword there, right? Yeah, it's definitely a little strange, right? I will say this to me is going on the side now. I'm sure I'm sounding like a broken record on this, but this is the kind of play that I think is perfect for learning how to code. So as you all are learning new concepts, try and break stuff, try and change things around to make sure you understand it, which I think is a great way to sort of try and fuss with it so we can figure out what's going on. All right, so let's try and check some of our assumptions here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add some console log statements in here. We'll have a mistake. We'll do one here, and we'll just put the animal in here. This will help us sort of see what's going on. and which lines of code are running. All right, let me clear this out. Let's go ahead and run this again. In your head, think about what's going to get logged out here. Just try and make a guess. What statements do we think are going to get logged out? I feel like I'm like Dora the Explorer here a little bit. You'll have your guess, you have your idea. All right, let's go ahead and run the code, see what happens. All right, this is interesting, right? So here's what we see in the output. We see the word lion, we see the word fox, and then we see our final output of your defining characteristics. So yeah, pretty much as Joseph described. So what's happening here, right, is bravery is getting matched, and then the code starts running. So you go, great, let's log out lion, let's assign favorite animal to lion, fantastic. But then we don't see break. So it just keeps running. It goes down, okay, let's log out fox, let's assign favorite animal to fox. Okay, let's go ahead and break. And now we get out of the statement. So at this point, the point that we break, favorite animal is fox, even though our defining characteristic is bravery. Right, so that break keyword is really essential to make sure the switch statement works like it should. A little tricky for sure. I think the syntax here feels very different from some of the other JavaScript code that we've written. But I'll say, I think a lot of people seem to like this sort of format. And it certainly is a bit more clear in some way. It's because you can see exactly what is getting checked and be able to do so with that variable. So there are certain situations where a switch statement can really make a lot more sense than perhaps a bunch of different equality checks or an if-else statement. All right, any questions about this before we move on? Right. Okay. So definitely kind of tricky, right? We have a few different ways now to help us make decisions within our code. Well, so let's move over to an exercise. If you all have questions, you can continue writing them out. It's all good. All right, we're going to ask you all to build a basic calculator using a switch statement. So consider a basic calculator program that performs addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Task is to complete the JavaScript code using a switch statement, declare and initialize three variables, operand 1, operand 2, and operation. We represent the numbers involved in the operation and the actual operation, which could be either add, subtract, multiply, or divide. So here's a little example here. I'll copy this up so you can take a look. Right, this is kind of what we're expecting are our three variables here. Choose from add, subtract, multiply, and divide to write a switch statement to perform the specified operation based on the value of the operation variable. Use these two values, these provided operand values, for the calculations. And then write a default case that just logs out invalid operation. So what this is going to look like is you're going to have your switch statement, and then depending on this value, if that matches up with add, you want to add those two numbers together. If it matches up with subtract, you're going to subtract operand 2 from operand 1, right? So build just a little basic calculator, and if the operation doesn't match any of the allowed operations, then you're going to print out invalid operation. All right, let's get some practice with this. Give you all a little bit of time here because this could be a bit tricky. Feel free to switch back and forth. Give about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes for y'all to do this. If you get done, please do share in live chat. It really helps me just know where you all are at. And then we'll come back and chat. All right, folks. Let's take a look at the solution here. I'll walk through it with you all. Pull this up from the solution and we'll talk through it. So what we're looking at here is we have our three variables defined at the top, just like we did initially. And then we have our switch statement. Our switch statement uses the switch keyword, passes in this operation. So in this case, we passed in divide. And in each of our cases, it's a similar process. We check the string value to see if it matches add, subtract, multiply, or divide. We'll then console log out the result of that operation with those two operands. And then we make sure to break. That break will stop us from continuing down and printing out another statement as well, right? Just like we saw. If the operation doesn't match any of those, we have our default, and we're going to log out invalid operation. Let's go ahead and run this code. So in this case, we get 5, right? So we're saying 15 divided by 3, that'll equal 5. We tried to do something like divide with a capital D, we'll get invalid operation. We swapped it to something like add, we'll go ahead and add those numbers together. So what I would say about switch case, I think the idea is very straightforward. The syntax feels very different to me than some other things with JavaScript, but it certainly can be really clear sometimes. What do you all think? If you had to build something like this, do you favor switch? Do you favor if else? What do you think looks clear to you? What do you think is easier to understand? Just wondering what your opinion is. Okay, we got that several people are typing. It will depend, the most software developer answer ever. All right, Joseph's all in for switch. Nice, nice. Yeah, people seem to love switch. They're just like, it looks cool. Maybe it makes, a bit more sense for folks just having these little cases in here. Any other thoughts? Right, that's okay. Then I'm just telling you all, if you want to be soft developers, you got to come up with unimportant, strong opinions on things. It's just required. You gotta fight to the death about I'm always going to use if else or whatever it may be. All right, so we talked about a number of different ways to implement decisions in our code. Right, we talked about if else, else if statements. Those can be nested within one another. They can be quite long. Right, there's lots of different ways for us to do that. We then talked a bit about logical operators and or as well as the not operators. Those can help influence our conditions that we put in an if statement. They can also sort of combine some if statements together into a more complex conditional, checking if a value is both above some number and below some value, right? Or checking that two different kinds of situations are true, like the email is not blank and it's a valid email, something like that. And then we talked about switch statements. With switch statements, we're able to use different kind of syntax, but to check one variable value, one expression, and match that against different values. We also talked about truthy and falsy values. There are some specific falsy values, like not a number, 0, -0, empty string, undefined, null, and false. Those all evaluate to a falsy value. While other values, even like a string with a space in it, that will evaluate to a truthy value. And we saw some situations where that could be used to sort of influence our code and also help us make some decisions. So as we discussed, when we come back, we're going to have a couple different problems to work through using that. We'll go ahead and take our break now. So take a 10-minute break and come back at about 45 minutes afterwards. All right, hope you all enjoy it. Go ahead and stretch, take a moment to clear your brain, and we'll see you all soon.
Hello, everyone. Well, we're gonna check and learn some poll to see how you're feeling about the content. You should see it right now. Nice, nice. I understand it fully. Almost everyone. Perfect.
All right, seems like it's going pretty okay. Thanks y'all. Welcome back. Thanks so much, Juan. Really appreciate it. Excellent. Let's then move on to our lab. I'll give you all some time to work on this. All right, cool. So there are actually two challenges here, two different problems to work on within our lab. I'll walk through both of them, give you a little bit of time. I also have an extra sort of challenge sheet for you all. I'll post that in resources in case any of you end a little bit early. So let's start with this first one. So imagine you're organizing a coding competition. You need to check the eligibility of participants based on their age. In this challenge, what you're going to do is you're going to define a participant age, and then depending on that age, you're going to print out some different values here. All right, so that is what we're trying to do with this first one. With this second one, we are going to define a variable called day number and give it a number representing a day. So 1 being Monday, 2 being Tuesday, etc. And you'll use a switch statement to determine the day of the week. And that will print out whatever that day is. For both of these, you're welcome to just hard code the values. If you've been playing around with prompts, you're welcome to do that too, whatever feels most fun. But again, we're focusing on if-else statements and on the switch statement itself. So those are the two tasks you have to do. The extra task that I'll throw this into resources, just a little like sheet I put together to help sort of practice evaluation of some of the different orders of different operands that we talked about and the logical operators, things like that. So you'll see on here, there are a number of different semi-complex or increasing complexity statements. For all of these, how I would suggest you work through this is first take a look at what the statement is, and then anticipate what the result's going to be, and then you can go ahead and check that. You can run this code, in Codio. You can also, of course, open up your Internet Inspector and run the code down here to check. So again, the way to do this is to first read this statement and try and make a guess as to what it's going to evaluate to, not to just run the code, which will not necessarily help you learn anything. So I'll share this out as well. And as you can see, these get much trickier as as they sort of continue on in terms of what's most difficult. All right, excellent. So those are your two tasks, 2 plus an extra 1 task. I think we'll say like 20 minutes on the clock, just to give everyone enough time to do this. If you get to a spot where you're done, please do let us know in chat. If it seems like most folks are closing out of this relatively early, then we might come back a little bit earlier, or if it seems like no one said anything, but then we get 20 minutes, then we might give you all a little bit longer, at which point we'll go over the solutions. If you have any questions, please let us know in chat, and yeah, we'll answer those and help out where we can. All right, good luck, you all. All right, excellent. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. All right, welcome back, y'all. It's been 20 minutes. It looks like folks were doing pretty well getting through it. Hopefully you all are feeling at an okay spot. So what I'm gonna do is I'll go ahead and just walk through the solutions with you all. If you're still working on it, honestly, and you feel like you're getting it, then feel free to ignore me, just continue working. You spending time actually coding is more important than you just listening to me yammer on. But if you are at a good spot or feeling a little confused, let's walk through it together, and then I'm happy to answer some questions about the code. All right, taking a look at this first one. So this is our age eligibility checker. So here's what your code might look like, or something like this. We're looking for something where participant age, you're checking the value of participant age according to different values and conditions that are over here in the instructions. So for example, first here, we're checking invalid age entered. Please provide a valid age. If it's somehow less than 0, right? That doesn't work. If it's less than 12, you're eligible for a junior category. If it's less than 18, you're eligible for the teen category. Otherwise, you're eligible for the open category. So, a few different ways that you could have written this out. You might have flipped the order. Perhaps you were checking for, all values above. That works too. A nice thing to do first is even just to check. Perhaps you're checking if it was a number or something like that. There's a few different ways you can fuss with that to end up with the same result here. Either way, you're probably going to be using an if, an else, and else if statements in here. All right. So something hopefully like that. Now, Tatiana was having an issue. I think it's a really good one, or a frustrating one, I should say. So let me go ahead and share that code on this. I'm going to paste this in. Space some things out here so you can see. Let me comment out this code here. All right, let me ask you all before I share. Does anyone notice the problem happening here? I think it's a little bigger too. Excellent. More problems is all good. Does anyone else see the problem here in this code? Maybe we ask this. You notice any odd color changes that you weren't expecting? So one of the really nice things about working with an IDE as opposed to just like a plain text editor is that the environment here inside this lab script JS, we can just kind of just visually see like, okay, something's off color-wise, right? So look at this first console log, we see that the string is coming up as green. Okay, interesting. And then when we look down here, these are all different somehow. They're all a little bit different. So something's going on there. So when we run this code, we get invalid or unexpected token, and it's saying it's on the line you're eligible for the team category. So right here. Okay, so this is frustrating. I'm sorry, Tatiana, but it's a good opportunity for us to talk about it. You'll notice, well, maybe you'll notice it's really hard. Like really try and get this big so you can take a look. Do you notice that the quotations here are actually different than the quotations here? So these quotations, my guess is you copy and pasted the text that was over here. But sometimes when we have written text, we use these sort of like quotations with little curly bits on the end. This is just for text. And often if we're copying and pasting pure text across, we'll end up with these symbols in here. But this is not, like JavaScript doesn't see this as a string, right? It just sees it as sort of some strange symbol instead. So that's the issue I think you're having here. So let's go ahead and try and fix this up a little bit. I'll swap these out with our regular quotation marks. And if we run this, okay, cool, awesome. Getting a new error, let's talk about this error. So this one right here, we have node lab script. It's telling us on line 18, and it's actually pointing to it. Yeah, thanks, Ravish. Right, and so here we just need to combine these symbols together. This is the actual symbol here, whereas this, it's seeing greater than a sign equals to something, right? JavaScript doesn't entirely know what we mean here, so we do have to combine these together. Let's try that again. All right, perfect. We're slugging away at a couple other little problems here. So this one, let's see. Unexpected token, that one. I don't know, do you all see the issue here? New space between all. Huh, where do you see that? I mean, it looks like, I'm guessing it's somewhere around here. It's less than 0, 14, 16, and 18. Like you're staying in the space here. I think actually this shouldn't really matter here. That should actually be okay. We should be able to have this sort of collapse in here, although it's nice to have this extra space here. Instead, I think something else is happening here. else is default. I feel like I have to say a bit more here. Let's actually try and cut this out, see if the rest of this code runs. Excellent. Yeah, okay, yeah. Thank you. I see what you're saying. Yeah, so here we're missing the else if keyword as opposed to just else. So either we could have else here, or we can have else if, but we can't combine these two, which is what we're looking at here. Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Dragesh and Joseph. All right, so something like this should still run, or something like this should still run. Cool. Lots of little small problems, but perfect. Honestly, this is the kind of stuff where it just takes a little bit of time, sort of plug away and take out some of these little issues and really try and do your best to use the error messages to help define and understand what's going on in the code. So thanks for sharing that. Really appreciate it. One more thing I just want to talk about here in terms of solution. And then I apologize, we haven't really talked about this too much. I'm sure you talked about it a little bit with David for HTML and CSS. In terms of formatting your code, so I'm sure you all saw this, particularly with HTML. HTML can be wild if you don't add like spaces, you don't enter down, right? It can turn into sort of this just like mass of text. JavaScript is a bit like that as well. So you all might have noticed me bouncing around, sort of adding spaces between things and sort of spacing things out. So I just want to talk about some of the common formatting things you might do, which shouldn't affect the like how the code runs, but it will affect how you're able to see it, how other folks can work with it, and how easy it is to debug. So first of all, we talked about, I mentioned earlier, like code being flat, like just a regular non-nested if statement being flat. They were saying that all of these lines right here, they're flat against sort of the left side of our IDE here, right? And the idea is that each line of code should be basically pushed as far left as it can be, but we're going to add some spaces in whenever we're entering some new sort of process, a new block of code. So the example here is when we're defining variables, right? It would be like something like this. Should still work fine, but it's unclear exactly what we're looking at. It starts to get a little like, well, why, where, this else if is sort of hidden in here, right? Visually, the computer doesn't really care. We should be able to run this just fine. But we want to be able to make it easy enough for us to be able to understand what's going on. So when you're writing your code, you're going to start with no spaces and just writing as much as possible. As soon as you enter a new block of code, and so for example, with our if statement, you'll notice inside of here, we've spaced in a little bit. Now, typically most IDEs, just doing a tab will push you right to where you need to be. And most of these editors will change the tabs that in terms of the actual like text that's there is 2 spaces. We had another if statement inside of here. We want to do the same thing where we continue to add just a couple spaces so we can start to see sort of the structure of our code as it continues to move downwards. So it's just something to keep in mind. Again, there's not necessarily any impact to the code itself if you don't have the spacing, but I think you all will find is trying to encounter errors. It's much easier to read your code if it's nicely spaced. And that includes for things like you don't need to create spaces between these parentheses and this curly brace, but it's a nice thing to do. Staying consistent, I would say, is actually more important than anything else. If you feel like, man, I don't like having these spaces afterwards, I want it to be really close, then at least stick with that. Having it so that it looks, it's different every single line, it kind of just makes it hard to parse and read. So just something to keep in mind here in terms of code quality. Right. And this is the kind of like skill that, again, it's not like essential in terms of your program running well. When you're working on a team, you want to be writing good code with your teammates because they're going to be the ones who really need to read your code and understand it. And yeah, it's no fun to work with someone who has messy code all over the place. It's much more fun when it feels very clear and clean and easy to digest. All right, so that's our first example here. Let's go over to our next one. So for this one, we used a switch statement. I'd say pretty straightforward in terms of the ask here, although I think the code is certainly can be quite tricky. So in this case, day number 3, so we're expecting that to be if we have Monday as 1, so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We then have our switch keyword. We pass in day number, that variable. And with this value, it's going to look down for each case and find which one matches. In this case, 3 will match. And then we'll log out the appropriate day. If we do something like this, right, we should be able to print out invalid day. So this one, again, like we talked about, really important to remember to use break here and important to include a default as well. All right, excellent. So I'm going to share another example here, which I appreciate. So in this example, Tatiana, what you have here is you're saying day number equals 1, I think, and then, so I'm just looking back at this image. You have it as Elsa. Okay. So just as a quick answer then for your code without the switch. So you're only using 1 equal sign, which means you're reassigning that value. If you want to check for equality, you'll need to use 2 equal signs for loose equality, and ideally 3 equal signs for strict equality. All right. So that'll be the change I think you need to make there. Any other questions you all have about either of these 2 challenges? No worries. Yeah, sometimes there's something, particularly when you're typing a lot of code, everything starts to kind of look the same. Variable names start to show up and you're like, is that a real word? I don't know. So it can definitely be tricky. Right, no other questions? That's feeling good. Cool. Cool. All right, let's wrap up here. Hopefully, as you all have seen, today we're starting to get into a bit more interesting of code, right? We're wrapping up, now we can start to make decisions. I really appreciate a lot of you are playing around with prompt and trying that out. That's exactly the kind of like play we want to encourage. It's a great way to learn and will help you all sort of solidify those concepts. With our conditional statements, we can now do interesting things with our program, like conditionally run certain code, to, depending on user input, depending on what values we put into it. And we talked about truthy and falsy values, identifying some of those falsy values, and learned some ways that we can use logical operators as well to combine, modify conditions, and otherwise sort of create a little bit more interesting expressions to be evaluated. So we're going to continue to move forward on some of these more tricky concepts. I believe our next lesson, I want to say, is iterations. Yeah, that's going to be, we're kicking up the gear, really punching into high gear here. So once we get into loose iterations, I think you all are going to see we have a lot of power in our programs to build some really interesting stuff. And I'll say after just this next lesson, but after the next few weeks, you all can imagine you can build a lot of different things, the tools you would be able to build. So to recap, you all are building up your skills right now. Hopefully, as we're adding more skills, you all are seeing the uses of these tools and considering and thinking about what kind of fun programs we can make with these. Last thing I'll say is I did share out, again, this little evaluating expressions practice. Please do, if some of this is feeling a bit tricky or confusing, I think these can be useful to kind of guess and check on and see if you have a good concept, a good understanding of these concepts. If you have any questions about these, feel free to just ping me in chat and we'll discuss. I think that's it for today. We're hitting up right against time here. Any notes from you?